back to Madden 101 here on the Zan Madden YouTube channel. In this series, we're trying to focus on making you guys a smarter Madden player as well as a smarter football fan, so that way you guys know what you're looking at. As normal with this series, not everything that I talk about here will apply one-to-one from real life into the game of Madden. However, this foundation that I hope we can build together can serve you into the future. Maybe it will work in the next Madden, or maybe it has worked in previous Maddens, and hopefully make you guys a little bit more knowledgeable as a football fan if some of these things that you hear on television do confuse you. In today's video, we're going to be going over defensive nomenclature and defensive line techniques, as well as what the difference is between a 1 and a 2 gap defensive system. Let's go ahead and get into it. Welcome back to Madden 101. So let's go ahead and get right into it today. We're going to start off with something that I think most players typically will understand, and that is what are the gaps. Now, the gaps that exist, you've probably heard of A gap, B gap, C gap, D gap potentially, and then also the alley. These are basically the spaces that exist between offensive linemen. So if I were to go ahead and talk about the area that is between a center and a guard on either side of the center, those gaps are known as the A gaps. If we were to go to the outside of the offensive guards to the area in between the guard and the tackle, this area on both sides is referred to as the B gap. And then the next gap over is the space between a tackle and a tight end. If there is a tight end on that side of the formation, that is known as the C gap. Now, if there is a second tight end in your formation, there remains potential for there to be a D gap, although these are a little bit less common. So when you guys hear the phrase, oh, that's an A gap blitz, what they're basically saying is that you're setting up a pressure in which the free runner is designed to come in through the A gap. So that might look something like this when it comes to a blitz against maybe a 5-out approach. So if I send everybody out, you're going to see here that the runner is going to come in through the A gap. If you were to get pressure between the guard and the tackle, that's obviously going to be known as a B gap. So a B gap blitz might be something that looks something like this against a 5-out offense. In which case we had our B gap rusher picked up by the offensive tackle, and it actually came in off the edge. But the reason that that was going to be a free runner at the quarterback is because we had pressure into the B gap, forcing the tackle to pinch down and allow the outside-most runner to come in untouched. And that's something for maybe a different topic as it pertains to pass protection in Madden, but typically offensive linemen tend to target inside to outside. So the most likely threat often comes off the edge, even when you're trying to attack through the B gap. And of course, as you guys saw with that example, if the guy comes in off the edge, that is basically going to come in through the C gap if the tight end were to stay. There's really not a gap if the tight end leaves, it doesn't stay in the block. So really that's just free edge pressure if that guy comes in off the edge. So I think that that's pretty self-explanatory. Gaps are fairly straightforward. A, B, C, inside to outside. Now what we're going to do is we're going to start to talk about defensive line techniques. And this is something that is maybe a little bit more complicated, but I think we're going to break it down in a way that is pretty easy to understand. This has actually evolved a little bit in modern times from what Bear Bryant used to teach at the University of Alabama. So defensive line techniques are a numbering system that basically tell defensive linemen where to line up as it relates to how the offensive line typically lines up. Now, in real football, certain offensive schemes might widen or narrow down the gaps, meaning that the A gap in a certain system might be tight. This is referred to as your offensive lineman splits. Sometimes you'll have the linemen stand a little bit closer together. Sometimes you'll have them set up a little bit further apart, and this benefits different types of run schemes. However, in Madden, the splits of the offensive linemen are pretty standard. You're not going to see varying splits. But nonetheless, the technique or the number of your linemen in their technique refers to where they're lining up, regardless of how the offensive linemen stay. So let's go ahead and talk about how this works. The easiest way to remember this is that it goes even numbers are head up, odd numbers fill the gaps. So when we talk about the player that is dead over the center in a defense, this is known as your zero technique, also known as a nose tackle. If you were to have players that were head up on the guards, those players would be lining up in what is known as a two technique. Now, two techniques typically are not found in a 3-4 defense, although they are something that you might pinch your defense and occasionally get a two technique. But if you had a player that, you know, lined up head up on a guard, like say Bocce Jr. were to put his hand in the dirt, this would be a two technique where he is lined up. Same could be said if we were to have this player, Pratt, hand in the dirt, lined up on the right guard. He would be in a two technique. So if the 0 is head up on the center and the 2 is head up on the guard, that means that head up on the tackle is what is referred to as a 4 technique. Now, the 4 technique actually has a different basically alignment that we're starting to see used a little bit more commonly in the NFL and certainly in college to deal with some of these spread offenses. And you're starting to see what is referred to as a 4-eye. When you start to add in that little I into the nomenclature, that's saying that they're going to line up in a 4 technique, but they're going to play a slight inside shade, meaning that they're going to line up inside shoulder of the tackle. So right here, if you were to really look into Sam Hubbard's role here, right here, he is lined up in a 4-eye. Typically, if you have 2 4-eyes, meaning you have a 4-eye right here, a 0, and then a 4-eye, a lot of defenses refer to this as a tight front or a TITE, tight front. And that's, again, something that makes the modern spread offenses a little bit tougher to, get their linemen into space and block to the second level. That's maybe a little bit further and more advanced than I want to get right here in the 101, but I just thought it was a little bit interesting. You guys have probably heard of the 4-eye as a more evolving and popular defensive line technique. And we're starting to see players in the NFL, or we're starting to see scouts in the NFL start to look towards finding true 4-eyes that can really disrupt and kind of allow, I wouldn't say a worse defense, but not necessarily a sturdy second level linebackers, because you can kind of flow to the football a little bit better by disrupting with those 4-eyes. Now, if you were to go ahead and start to kick it out even further to say like a tight end, for instance, this is something that can get a little bit confusing depending on who you talk to. You start to get into a little bit of confusion with the tight end and the techniques on a tight end. But much like head up on a center, guard, and tackle is a 0, 2, and 4, head up on a tight end is a 6. Now, a lot of coaches nowadays are going to start to use the 6-eye. And what I'm about to share with you is the odd numbering for defensive line techniques. So when it comes to a odd defensive line technique, we're talking about the gaps in between those linemen. If head up is even, the gap is odd. So if I were to have Hill lined up right here in between the center and the right guard, this is a 1 technique. And oftentimes you will hear of a nose tackle. They oftentimes will play this 0 technique, but sometimes if they line up in a 1 or they line up on a shoulder of the center, that is basically going to refer to them as a shade nose, or a nose tackle that shades one way or the other on the center. So you're typically going to have the 1 techniques that are going to line up in either a gap and try to plug that lane. And we'll start to get into 1 gap and 2 gap systems here momentarily. So if the A gaps essentially are 1, that means that the B gaps are going to be what you would refer to as kind of your 3 techniques. The 3 technique is a little bit more commonly found in a 4-3 defense. So I think to better show what the 3 technique looks like, I'm going to call a 4-3 normal here to kind of break this down. And you're going to see right here that you've got essentially you've got a 3 technique right here in DJ Reader, and then you've got basically a 1 technique right here in Hill. So we'll start to kind of break down why these defenses, whether you're in a 4-3 or a 3-4, typically use different techniques here momentarily. Now, when we start to talk about playing to the gap in between a tackle and a tight end, this is where it starts to get a little bit weird, because if you were to go all the way back to the Bear Bryant days, believe it or not, a 6 technique, which is what we talked about being lined up head up on a tight end, a 7 technique for some reason lines up inside of a 6 technique. And a lot of modern coaches have gotten away from this nomenclature because it's confusing for younger kids. Like if it goes 0, 2, 4, 6, and it goes 1, 3, 5, and then 7 is inside of a 6, that doesn't make a ton of sense. So what we kind of have to do here with this is get to a point where you know, it's a little bit more easily absorbed for players. So you've got this 5 technique, and then which is basically lined up, plug in the C gap, but then you have this kind of inside, like if Hubbard were to line up on the inside shoulder of the tight end, Bear Bryant would refer to that as a 7 technique, but modern coaches will refer to that as a 6-eye. So again, playing off of that 4-eye technique that we talked about a little bit earlier when I was in the 3-4 defense, that is something that, you know, you've kind of had this dichotomy in the way that it's taught. A lot of old school coaches will call an inside shade on the tight end a 7, and a lot more modern coaches will call it a 6-eye. And then what they'll do is they'll say that the 7 is actually going to be the outside shoulder of the tight end. So sometimes you get this 7 technique. Now, when you start to talk about further techniques, you don't really have an 8 tech. There's really nothing, you don't often find an 8 technique in football, but you guys have, I'm sure, heard of the 9 tech. And the 9 tech is essentially a player that would line up outside shade on a tight end. Basically, if there was another tight end outside, he would kind of plug that gap for a second tight end. So the wide 9, as it's been called, is basically going to line those defensive ends or outside linebackers so wide that they're coming in at such a tough angle, and it's basically designed to kind of filter the run inside, and also more so than anything provide a pretty dominant edge rush angle towards the quarterback. It creates some problems for you know, offensive tackles, especially if they you know, struggle with their agility to get out there and cut off that edge. But those are the techniques as it pertains to you know, the gaps, the way the linemen line up, the way the linemen line up in the gaps, and you know, a lot of those a lot of this nomenclature that you hear is going to be, you know, in reference to a certain type of defensive tackle. So I kind of want to now transition into using those techniques and explaining what their roles are in various defenses, because when we talk about competitive Madden, there's a lot of defenses out there, and the role of those defensive line techniques kind of changes based off of what you're in. You'll oftentimes notice that in competitive Madden, you see a lot more dollar, 245 odd. You sometimes see some 335 wide, and every once in a while you'll get kind of like a 245 or a nickel with 4 defensive linemen. Now let's go ahead and talk about 1 gap and 2 gap. So 1 gap and 2 gap, this is maybe a phrase you have heard of, maybe it's not. Defenses basically play either a 1 gap system or a 2 gap system. And to be completely truthful with you guys, modern NFL defenses actually more than ever are playing kind of a hybrid 1 gap system, which just means that some players play 1 gap and other players play 2 gap. If you don't know what this means, we're basically saying that in certain defensive schemes, a defensive lineman might be responsible for playing 2 run lanes. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to put the 3-4 odd on the field again, and you're going to take a look right here at the run fits. To pull up your run fits, all you have to do is hold the left trigger, and then you're going to, for the right side run fit, you're going to hold the B icon. And basically what that's going to do is it's going to show you what every single player's run fit is if the ball's run to the right. So you see right here that you've got everybody with a straight line into their gap. Now, if I go ahead and show the run fit to the other side, you'll notice that basically in this 3-4 defense, you have a lot of two gap players, meaning that their run fit changes when you go left versus right. This is a really, really important thing to know, because basically this says that, you know, this nose tackle Hill is responsible for either a gap. And oftentimes defensive tackles in a two gap system are not going to be dominant pass rushers. They're more so read and react defenders that are trying to diagnose where the run is going to. And then once they've cleared that it's not truly a run, then they start to try to disrupt and get to the passer. But being a pass rusher oftentimes for a nose tackle in a two gap system is going to be a secondary assignment for them. So you see right here that with this two gap defense, you've got essentially the nose tackle, both middle linebackers, and both of those defensive ends that are lined up in those 4 or 4-eye techniques. They have to basically play two gaps. They have to play to, you know, a gap to their right and to their left. Now, the importance of a two gap defense is actually pretty nice in Madden. In a two gap defense, it's great because what you can effectively do is have better coverage. When you have everybody in your defense, or a vast majority of your players in your defense, covering two gaps, basically what that's saying is if the run is going to go to the, you know, if a run is going to go to the left, you might have the nose tackle playing the left A gap, as well as this player Bocce also filling that gap potentially. And the same to the right. If you know, you have the run to the right, you're going to have the nose tackle playing to that right A gap, but this player Pratt can also play into that gap. Now, he also is going to be responsible for this gap as well, and as is Hubbard. So Hubbard is playing the B gap and also the C gap on this defense. So you basically end up with these linebackers that play both the A and the B gaps. You have these 3 down linemen that are both playing, well, this guy's going to play both the A and the B gaps. This guy's going to play both A gaps. These linebackers are going to play their respective A gap and B gap. And then you have these defensive ends that are going to play their respective B gap and C gap. And then, of course, you have these edge defenders that are responsible for, you know, filling their essentially for Wilson, you're just kind of playing the edge. There's really not a gap here because there's not a lineman on the left to kind of create a gap. But you see that if the ball is run left or right, Wilson is only technically responsible for that one gap, which is right here where that line goes to, which is the outside of the left tackle. Over here on this side, you've got Bailey, who on a run to the outside is playing outside on the tight end. And then if the run is away from him, he's still playing outside on the tight end. So kind of have these guys only responsible for one gap, but basically the interior 5 defenders in this defense are responsible for 2 gaps. So that is kind of what you would hear referred to as a 2-gap defensive system. And typically that's going to be something you see with a lot of these odd fronts, 3-4 odd, 2-4-5 odd, you know, depending on the personnel grouping you have on the field. Odd fronts oftentimes end up with many 2-gap players. Now, when you start to get into some of these 4-3 defenses, that's where you start to see more of a 1-gap style system, meaning that every single player has their gap regardless of a run or a pass, and their job is to just blow up their gap. So when you think about 1-gap defenses, I, as a Bear fan, definitely think back to the Lovie Smith and Rod Marinelli. When Rod Marinelli was our defensive coordinator, you typically start to see a lot of these 1-gap systems where you have these defensive linemen that are actually more disruptive as pass rushers, because regardless of what the play is, run or pass, you end up with that guy obliterating his gap no matter what. And that's how you start to end up with a lot of times in a 4-3 defense, you hear the phrase of a disruptive 3. A disruptive 3. Well, a disruptive 3 is simply referring to the 3 technique and his importance in the B gap of the 4-3 based defense. Or, you know, a 4-3, if you take a linebacker off the field, becomes a nickel defense, but the techniques of the linemen might stay the same. In nickel, you're just removing an extra linebacker. So a disruptive 3 technique might go ahead and be able to sack the passer as a, you know, a player that is a pass rusher, and also he's responsible for his run lane, which is oftentimes just the 1 gap. So when I go ahead and show my run fits here against this inside zone reader, has the left B gap as that 3 tech. When the run is to the right, Reader technically is responsible for the interior A gap, but you kind of see that this is why we start to talk about hybrid one gap systems. And that's why I said Madden is a little bit complicated. It does both. You see Reader right here is the 3 tech. He technically is responsible for his B gap and then also the left A gap as well. So he's got to be a little bit more read and react as a run defender. But if you take a look at our shade nose, or that one technique that I broke down earlier, Hill, he actually on a run to the left or the right is just responsible for playing his gap, which is that right A gap. And then the linebacker behind him is actually a 2 gap defender. Pratt has got the left A gap as well as the right B gap. So that's really, really important for you guys to see here, is that in Madden, you oftentimes end up with some players on your defense being 1 gap defenders, and then you end up with some players being 2 gap defenders in their run technique. So you definitely can see that right here. Now, if you take a look at the rest of the players in this defense, who are the other 2 gap players? Well, basically you see that our defensive end right here, Hendrickson, let me click off of him here. Hendrickson is playing the same gap no matter what, run left or run right. If you take a look at the other defensive end, he is playing the same gap no matter what. If it's a run to the left, he's playing the outside shoulder of the tackle. If it's a run to the right, he's playing the outside shoulder of the tackle. And then this safety that's in the box in this particular defense is responsible for playing not only the B gap on the right, but also playing, kind of a contain or a force defender that keeps the run to the inside of him on a run to the right. So it is very, very complicated. It is very, very complicated. And the modern NFL defenses are getting more complicated. You definitely are starting to see defenses where certain defensive linemen are responsible for 2 gaps, kind of diagnose and shed. Oftentimes, when you have a player that's a 2 gap run defender, oftentimes he has a 2 gap run defender behind him. Just to kind of serve as insurance, because if he's responsible for 2 gaps and he gets blown up, you have to have somebody else behind him that can help. Whereas in a 4-3 defense, oftentimes you see a little bit more of the 1 gapping. Right here, I'm in like a 4-3 cover 2. If we go ahead and show you these run fits, now all of a sudden in the cover 2, everybody on the defensive line is a 1 gap rusher. You see that no matter what in this cover 2 defense, all 4 of our linemen stay put, and the linebackers behind are responsible for 2 bubbles or 2 gaps. Again, you see here Pratt is responsible for the right B gap and the left A gap. You see that the right outside linebacker here, Bailey, is responsible for the technically he's responsible for the gap inside of Hubbard. He's basically playing head up on the tackle, but he's also responsible on a run away to get into the backside B gap on this play. So again, with a 4-3 defense, you see a lot of 1 gap rushers up front. And then typically you're going to see a few 2 gap defenders that play those empty bubbles behind. And the reason that they have to play those bubbles is because when you plug a player like Hill right here in this gap, his job is to completely obliterate the A gap and be disruptive. Much like Reader, his job is to obliterate that B gap and be disruptive there. These players, typically in a 4-3, your defensive tackles are better pass rushers than a defensive tackle in a 3-4. Again, it just makes sense. When you talk about a 0 technique in a 3-4 defense, he's trying to basically take that center and kind of read the play and shed either direction into both gaps. Whereas in this defense, he just knows I'm getting upfield in this A gap and I'm blowing up a run if it's coming here. That's really his responsibility. And then the responsibility of the read and diagnose and pursue is behind him in this defense. So hopefully all of that terminology kind of helps you guys understand, how these defenses are built in real life and kind of how important it is in Madden. Now, in a 1 gap defense in Madden, if you're kind of thinking towards like building a team and your abilities, I think it's really important that you kind of understand if you're looking at a 1 gap player, say your favorite defense is the 4-3 normal cover 2, which competitively it's not a good defense, but let's just say for the sake of argument that this is what you like. And you've got this guy Reader, he's responsible for this gap right here, this interior, it's a B gap on this side. He's in the 3 technique. So if you're looking to make sure that nobody beats you into that B gap, it's really, really important that this guy would probably be an inside stuff player, because you really want him to win and be disruptive in the run game in this. Now, as a pass rusher, you know, he's going to be able to get after that guard. So you're gonna see right here, he's gonna lock in that guard, oftentimes getting that one-on-one, and you see that he's gonna be able to win. A lot of times your D tackles in a 4-3 are more, like I said, disruptive. And that's a phrase that it's a buzzword for a lot of 4-3 coaches, that disruptive 3. It's hard to find. When you look at the Colts, they traded away picks for DeForest Buckner because Matt Eberflus ran a 4-3 defense in Indy. And he needed that disruptive 3 to make this defense go. So typically in a 3-4 defense, your defensive linemen, those defensive ends that line up in 4 eyes or 5s, and your zero techniques, they're responsible for 2 gaps. They're run defenders primary. And typically your pressure is schemed and coming from those linebackers. In a 4-3 defense, you're getting, a mix of 1 and 2 gap linemen, but mostly 1 gap lineman. And they're responsible for getting to the quarterback without you having to allocate those linebacker resources for pressure. Some defenses will still attack out of a 4-3. You know, you've heard of an attacking 4-3 defense before. Typically in those defenses, you get, you start to get into some shading, right? Some over and under fronts. And that is actually where we're going to go to next.